childbirth and mortality. The deadly marital debt marriage in the medieval world came with expectations. Once the vows were spoken and the union consummated, the next demand arrived almost immediately. Children, heirs, new life. For a bride, especially a young one, this was not a hope. It was a duty, a burden, a test. Childbirth was not sacred. It was survival, it was terror, and it was deadly. The church taught that marriage meant debt. The marital debt. Each spouse owed the other their body, for affection, for unity, but most of all, for reproduction. A wife owed her husband children, a husband owed her nothing but presents. The balance was not equal, the cost was not shared. It was her body that would bear the pain, her life that would hang in the balance, her blood on the floor, and no one asked if she was ready, because readiness was irrelevant. She was married, that was enough. Medieval. Women became mothers, young. Some were 14, some even younger, by the time they reached their 20s. Many had birthed 3 or 4 children. By 30, many were gone. There were no doctors, only midwives. There was no medicine, only herbs and hope. No hospitals, only hearths. Childbirth began in fear and ended in either silence or screams. Labor could last hours or days. If the baby was turned wrong, there was no way to correct it. If the mother bled too much, there was no way to stop it. If the child was stillborn, it was wrapped and buried by nightfall. Mothers were told to pray, to trust God, to obey their calling. Because this pain was part of their holy task. The church glorified motherhood, but it did not protect mothers. A woman who died in childbirth was seen as blessed, a holy martyr. She had fulfilled her role, but behind that theology was silence and grief. Husbands sometimes mourned, sometimes remarried the same year. The children often grew up motherless. Midwives carried the burden. They were not just birth assistants, they were guardians, priestesses of pain. They knew how to turn a child, how to ease the breathing, how to recognize death when it came creeping in. They used herbs like mugwort and fennel. They whispered prayers in Latin and Old French. They sang songs to calm the room, but they were not magicians. When things went wrong, they had no tools to stop it. In difficult births, the mother was tied down, held still, sometimes cut, sometimes left to die slowly. After the child was born, the fear did not end. Many babies died in the first week, from fever, from infection, from cold. The mother was expected to recover fast, return to her chores, return to the bed, because the debt was not paid once, it was paid again and again. There were women who gave birth to 10 children, only to survive. There were women who died on the 5th, the 7th, the 2nd. It did not matter. Death in childbirth was so common, people did not question it. They prepared for it, made funeral cloth before labor began, wrote last prayers on scraps of parchment, said goodbye. Without speaking, it was normal, and that is what made it cruel. Women had no say in when they would conceive. There was no control, no understanding of cycles or health. If a husband wanted her, she submitted. If he came home from war or from work or from wine, she opened the door. That was the duty. And if she refused, she was punished, shamed, blamed. Many women lived in fear of the next pregnancy. They carried children with dread, and when labor began, they often cried not from pain, but from knowing this might be the end. Some tried to avoid pregnancy. They used herbs. They prayed to saints. They faked illness. They drank teas made of rue or pennyroyal. risking death to avoid it. But the system was stronger. The marriage was a contract, and that contract required blood. We remember medieval battles and kings. We remember crusades and castles. But the true battlefield was in the bedroom, in the birthroom, in the silence after the last breath. Because behind every heir was a mother who risked everything. Behind every noble house was a line of women who died unnamed, unmarked, unheard. This was the deadly cost of being a wife. The marital debt, paid in flesh, in tears, in graves, and still they did it, again and again, because they had no choice, because the world demanded it, because survival meant sacrifice, escape, roots, annulments, widowhood, and rebellion in the medieval world. Marriage was supposed to be forever. Once vows were spoken, once the union was sealed, there was no turning back. For men, that meant obligation. For women, it often meant captivity. But not everyone stayed silent. Not everyone stayed still. Some women found ways out. Some escaped. Some rebelled. There were three main escape routes. Annulment, widowhood, rebellion. Came with risk. Each came with consequence. But they existed, and for some, they were the only hope. Let us begin with annulment. An annulment was not a divorce. The church did not believe in divorce. Marriage was sacred. Marriage was permanent. But an annulment said something different. It claimed that the marriage was never valid, that it had never truly happened, that the bond was broken because it was never real. There were rules, strict ones. If one person was already married, if the couple were too closely related by blood, if there was no real consent, if the marriage was never consummated, these were grounds, but proof was required. Witnesses were needed. Documents had to be shown. Most peasants could not afford this. They had no access to church courts, no influence, no voice. But nobles sometimes used it. Kings annulled marriages for political reasons. Wealthy men set aside wives to gain new alliances. And sometimes a woman won. She proved abuse, proved abandonment, proved the marriage had been forced. In rare cases, the church listened. In even rarer ones, it ruled in her favor. Those victories were whispered from village to village, not as law, but as hope. The second escape was widowhood, and this one came not through courts, but through death. A husband died, from war, from sickness, from accident, and suddenly the woman was free. For the first time, she controlled her household. She managed money. She raised her children alone. She could remarry if she chose, or she could remain a widow. Some widows chose solitude. They entered convents. They lived off small estates. They became midwives or healers. They walked the market streets with quiet power. A widow had more freedom than a wife, because no man stood above her. But widowhood had danger too. If there were no children, the land might revert to the husband's family. If the dowry had not been secured, she could be thrown out. Some were taken in by brothers or sons. Others ended in poverty. But for many, it was a kind of rebirth. The third escape was rebellion. And this was the most dangerous of all. A woman who ran from her husband broke the law. She became a criminal, a fugitive. If she was caught, she could be beaten, imprisoned, returned in chains. But still, some ran. Some hid in other villages, changed their names, lived among outcasts, found safety in the margins. Others sought refuge in convents where the veil could protect them. The church sometimes granted Sanctuary. Sometimes looked away. There were women who poisoned their husbands, who faked their deaths, who left in the middle of the night with children strapped to their backs and nothing but bread in their hands. We know of these stories because someone wrote them down. A priest, a town clerk, a bitter husband seeking revenge. But they prove something. Even in a world designed to trap them some, women broke free. They paid a price. They lost land. They lost names. They lost safety. But they found something else. They found choice. Rebellion was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, a refusal to obey, a secret prayer, a locked door. Resistance came in many forms. A woman who taught her daughter to say no, a widow who refused to remarry, a bride who spoke the truth before the altar. All of it was risk. All of it was defiance, because the system was not built for escape. It was built to hold, to trap, to silence, but not everyone stayed. Silent. Some used the law, some used the grave, some used courage, and in doing so, carved out freedom one hard breath at a time. Wedding feasts and rituals, from blackening to banquets. Not all of medieval marriage was grim and silent. Some parts were loud, filled with laughter, fire, drink, and celebration. The wedding feast was one of the few moments when joy broke through the pressure. A chance to eat, dance, and witness tradition, even if only for a day. For most families, rich or poor, the feast was the centerpiece of the marriage day. It followed the vows and sometimes came before the bedding. There was food, even in lean times. There was music, even if only a drum and flute. There were stories and games and rituals passed down for generations. In noble courts, the banquet was a display of wealth. Tables were piled with roasted meats, pies, nuts, fruit, pitchers of ale, candles burned, tapestries hung. Long processions of guests and servants moved through grand halls. 100 courses was not uncommon. Swans were cooked and served in full feathered display. Sugar sculptures, shaped like castles, stood beside gold-leafed loaves carried to the bride by hand. For common folk, the feast was simpler, but just as sacred. A stew pot fed the village. Flatbread was passed around. Goats, milk, and ale were poured freely. A pig, if they had it. A chicken or two, if they didn't. Cakes were made of honey, oats, sometimes barley. The couple sat at the center of the table or the fire circle, surrounded by neighbors, family, friends, and children. The music was local. Fiddles, pipes, bag drums. Rhythms kept time as people clapped and danced on packed earth or barn floors. Sometimes the rituals were playful, sometimes they were harsh. One strange and messy custom in Scotland and parts of Ireland was called the blackening. Before the wedding, the bride and groom were captured by their friends. Stripped, smeared with ash, soot, flour, feathers, rotten milk, anything foul, then they were paraded through the village, tied to carts or carried in wheelbarrows, to the sound of mocking cheers. It was a test of spirit, humiliation to prepare for the hard road of marriage. In Germany and Eastern Europe, there were kidnapping games. Friends would steal the bride and hide her in a local inn. The groom had to search for her, pay a small ransom, and buy drinks for everyone before the celebration could continue. These traditions brought the community into the marriage. They were loud, chaotic, and sometimes cruel, but they bonded everyone. In shared laughter and memory, feasts often included the gifting of tokens. Guests brought bread, salt, cloth, or coins. The Lord might present the couple with tools, livestock, or land. The priest offered prayers and sometimes a candle to keep burning through the first night in villages. People took turns roasting meat, pouring drink, singing local ballads about love, hardship, and loyalty. Some songs mocked the groom, some praised the bride, some warned of the marriage bed, all in jest. Tradition mattered. Every ritual had purpose. The eating of an egg together symbolized unity. The breaking of a plate ensured good fortune. The circling of a fire represented eternal love in some parts of Italy and France. Couples had to leap over a broom or a low wall to prove their strength or their fertility. In noble houses, Latin blessings were read aloud. Prayers to saints and to Mary were sung. Choirs sometimes filled the chapel before the meal began. Rich fabrics were spread on the tables. Children chased each other underfoot. Wine flowed until morning. These were not just feasts, they were statements. They showed the strength of the family, the support of the village, the survival of culture. Some marriages were arranged, some were forced. But the feast allowed the couple to smile, even briefly, to feel seen, to be treated as important. Even the poor shared what they had: a crust, a jug, a warm fire. They came together not just for the couple, but to renew community bonds, to remember that even in hunger there could be joy, that even in darkness a candle could burn long into the night. The wedding feast was not just a meal, it was a signal. This union matters. This life has begun, and for a moment, everyone could celebrate without fear. In the medieval world, marriage belonged to two powers. One was the church, the other was tradition. The church claimed authority over souls. It wrote rules, it blessed unions. It said who could marry, when, and how. It declared marriage sacred, a holy bond that no man should break. But custom was older. It lived in villages, in kitchens, in fields. It whispered through folk songs and danced through wedding fires. It did not ask permission. It simply endured. The tension between church law and local tradition shaped every medieval wedding. Sometimes they walked together, other times they clashed. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had begun to formalize marriage. It issued rules. A man and a woman must consent. The ceremony must be public. The union must be blessed by a priest. Banns must be read. Announcements made for 3 Sundays before the wedding. This was to prevent secret marriages, forced unions, or bigamy. But in many villages, people did not wait. They followed the old ways. A couple might join hands in front of witnesses and speak vows. They might move in together. That was enough. No priest, no chapel, no written record, just word and witness. The church called these irregular unions, but they were hard to stop, because everyone knew someone who had done it, because they had always done it that way. The church feared disorder. It feared confusion. Who was truly married? Who had rights to land, to inheritance, to a name? Without control, there was chaos. So the church worked to pull marriage under its wing. Priests began to educate. They told people that hand fasting was not enough, that sex outside of a church sanctioned marriage was sin, that unblessed unions could curse children, that God would turn his face away from homes born of disobedience. But old customs die hard in some regions. Couples still married at crossroads, still tied cords around their wrists, still shared bread and salt as a vow. They called on old gods, and saints alike. They said prayers in Latin and whispered spells in the same breath. The sacred and the superstitious were tangled together. The church tried to suppress certain rituals, like fertility dances, like love potions, like blackening, or symbolic trials. But these customs had power. They meant something to the people. They came from a time when faith was rooted in the ground, not just in the altar. Even the idea of consent was shaped by conflict. The church taught that both bride and groom must agree. But in practice, families still arranged marriages without consulting the bride. Fathers still gave daughters away like coin. The church said no marriage could be valid without the free will of both parties. But who was checking? Who was listening? The priest stood before the altar and asked, "Do you take this man?" And the girl, dressed in silk or rags, nodded. Was it choice or survival? The law said one thing, life said another. In noble houses, church, weddings were grand, bishops presided, choirs sang, candles lit the halls. But even here, custom crept in. A bride might carry rosemary or garlic to ward off evil. Guests might slip charms into her shoes. The church tried to bless away the old world, but the old world refused to vanish. For peasants, religion and tradition were not enemies. They were threads of the same cloth. They crossed themselves before hand fasting. They placed saints' images beside fertility stones. They baptized their children and still left offerings in sacred wells. The church slowly won. Over centuries, it took control of the rite. By the 13th century, most weddings in Europe had some church presence. But it was never complete, even as Latin prayers echoed through stone chapels outside the walls. Brides still danced barefoot. Grooms still drank from ritual cups. Mothers still whispered old rhymes to protect their daughters. Marriage was never just a legal bond, never just a spiritual rite. It was a joining of flesh and fear, of family and future. And in that moment, people wanted more than rules. They wanted protection, celebration, meaning that the church gave structure, tradition gave soul. Together, they shaped the medieval marriage, not always in peace, not always in balance, but together. Because a wedding was not only before God, it was also before the village, before the fields and the ancestors, before every unseen force that might bless or curse the lives about to be joined. Wives in the shadows, life after the wedding night. Music faded, the feast ended, the guests went home, and then came the rest of her life. For a medieval woman, the wedding was only the beginning. What followed was not romance, not leisure, not rest. It was work, it was silence, it was shadow. After the wedding night, a wife slipped into her new role. She became part of her husband's household. She cooked, she cleaned, she nursed children. She managed servants, if there were any. She rose before the sun and slept long after it set. And still, no one asked her what she wanted, because her wants did not matter. She had duties now, and those duties never ended. Her name changed, her status changed. Her identity disappeared. She was now wife, mistress of the home, bearer of heirs, in noble houses. She may have had rooms to manage, a staff to command, but even there, she lived under watch. Her words were measured, her actions controlled. She was always observed, always judged. For peasant wives, the weight was even greater. No servants, no rest, only labor. She fetched water from wells. She ground grain by hand. She mended clothing, She helped in the fields when needed. She raised children while preparing food. There was no such thing as free time, only the pause between tasks. A good wife was quiet. She did not argue, she did not complain. She served her husband with loyalty and care. She obeyed if she failed in these things. There were consequences. She could be beaten, blamed, shamed, and no one would stop it. The law protected the husband, not the wife, and yet women endured. They built homes from nothing. They raised strong children. They held families together while there. Husbands went to war or traveled for trade. They were the foundation no one praised. They were the fire behind the door. Steady, necessary, unseen. Some women found small freedoms in their routines. A walk to the market, a few minutes to spin wool and think. A story whispered to a child before sleep. Some found strength in each other. A sister, a neighbor, another wife who understood the silence. Together, they passed knowledge, herbs for pain, songs for sorrow, secrets for staying safe. In noble circles, a wife might play a political role. She wrote letters, managed estates in her husband's absence, made decisions when no one else could, but her power was always borrowed, never hers, always at risk, always at risk, always temporary. The church told her to be holy, to suffer as Mary had suffered, to remain pure in thought and action, even while serving a world that did not serve her. If she could not bear children, she was blamed if the children died. She was cursed. Her worth was tied to others, to her husband, to her sons, to how well she submitted. Widowhood offered her the most freedom, but only if she survived long enough. Most did not. They died in childbirth, from fever, from exhaustion, from being forgotten, and yet they kept going. Because they had no choice, because their survival was not about themselves, it was about everyone else. We rarely know their names, we rarely see their faces in the pages of history. But they were there, behind every lord, every knight, every village feast. They were there in the shadows, keeping the fires lit, feeding the hungry, holding the world together. They were wives, not in fairy tales, not in poems, but in truth, in dust and in duty, in grief and in grace, and their stories deserve to be remembered. Legacies of brutality, how medieval weddings echo today. We like to think the past is gone, that the old world died with castles and kings, that arranged marriages, child brides, forced unions, and public bedding ceremonies are part of a darker age, long buried beneath time. But they are not. The shadows of medieval marriage are still with us, not always in the same form, not with the same names, but the roots remain around the world today. Girls are still married before they are old enough to understand what marriage means. 12 years old, 10. Sometimes younger. Not for love, but for land, for status, for peace between families. Consent is still optional. In many places, a girl's silence is still mistaken for agreement. Her obedience is still demanded, not earned. In some countries, proof of virginity is still required. Women are shamed, tested, examined. Sheets are still stained on purpose. Rituals still enforce the idea that purity equals worth. And if the bride fails the test, the consequences are devastating. DOWRIES are still paid. Not in every culture, but enough to matter. Girls are still seen as burdens to be traded. Families go into debt just to marry off a daughter, and once she is gone, she is often never truly free again. Domestic violence is still protected by silence. In many marriages, women are still told to obey, still blamed for speaking out, still trapped with no way out, and in many places, marital rape is still not recognized as a crime, just like in medieval times. The law often sides with the husband. Just like then, the wife's body is still seen as part of the contract. The legacy of control still lingers. Girls are raised to be small, to be quiet, to be good, to endure, just like their grandmothers did, just like their ancestors were taught to do. Even in modern weddings, echoes of medieval ritual remain. The father gives away the bride. She wears white to signal purity. She is told the day is the most important of her life. The man waits at the altar. She walks to him. He does not walk to her. The structure seems beautiful, but it tells a deeper story. One of power, of control, of tradition passed down without question. Even in countries where marriage is a choice, where the law says both people must agree, culture often tells a different tale. That a woman is not complete until she marries. That her value rises with a ring. That a wife must sacrifice first, speak second, and be thankful always. These are not just old ideas, they are living ones. They shape how women see themselves, how men treat women, how society defines love, loyalty, and duty. And when we fail to see the roots, we fail to see the harm. We dress up the traditions. We call them sweet. We call them timeless. But some of them are not. Some of them are cages, dressed in lace, chains hidden beneath vows. To understand medieval marriage is to understand more than history. It is to look clearly at what we carry forward, what we have accepted as normal, what we must question, what we must undo. Because when a girl is told her voice does not matter, that her purity defines her, that her pain is holy, that her worth is only in what she gives to a man that is not. Tradition. That is trauma, and history tells us how deep those wounds run. But there is another side to this legacy. The resistance, the quiet rebellion. The women who ran, who said no, who endured and taught their daughters to endure less, who shaped new paths, even in the dark. That legacy matters too, and it is growing today. More girls say no, more women choose, more marriages begin with respect, not pressure. The old chains are breaking, one vow at a time, but only if we keep looking back, only if we keep asking hard questions, only if we keep seeing where we came from. The medieval marriage system was brutal. It was built on silence and obedience, but it taught us what to watch for, what not to become, what must never return, and that is why we remember, not to praise it, but to end it, the end of the story. Unheard voices and final truths. This is where the story ends, but not really, because the women at the heart of medieval marriage did not get endings. They didn't get closure. They didn't get to write their own words. Most left no records, no letters, no names carved in stone, and yet they were everywhere. In the kitchens, grinding grain, in the fields, bent under the sun, in the shadows of the chapel, lighting candles for children they had already buried in the corners of stone halls, stitching clothing, stitching silence. These were the women history forgot, and yet they held up the world. This book has walked through their lives, from forced vows to feast tables, From cold bedding ceremonies to the blood-stained sheets, from childbirth to early graves, from rebellion to resistance, each chapter revealed what was rarely spoken. Marriage, for many of them, was not love. It was not joy. It was not a beginning. It was an obligation, a survival tactic, a quiet war. But still, not all stories were the same. Some women found partnership. Some built homes that felt safe. Some husbands were gentle. Some marriages grew into something real. Even within the brutality, there were flickers of care, of shared labor, of laughter around the fire. The truth is not clean. It is layered, complicated, heavy. Some were trapped. Some endured. Some rose to power in court or castle. Some never had a chance. And all of them matter, because when we remember history, we often remember the wrong things. We remember kings and battles. We remember laws and lineages. We forget the people who lived beneath the weight of those systems. We forget the girl in the veil, the bride who was afraid, the mother who bled out. In silence, we forget the voices that never made it to parchment, but they were there, and they whisper still, in the rituals we follow, without thinking, in the customs we never question, in the language we use around love, obedience, and sacrifice. Their stories live in the echoes, in the way marriage is still shaped by control, in the way purity is still valued over voice, in the way consent is still negotiable for some. In some places, to remember them is to resist. Forgetting to tell their truth is to break the pattern, and so, this is the end. But it is also a beginning, because every time we hear a wedding vow, every time we watch a bride walk forward, every time we see tradition dressed in beauty, we must ask, where did this come from? Who paid for it first? And who gets to say yes today? The medieval wife is gone, but her shadow remains, and so does her strength. If she could endure what she did with no rights, no voice, no choice, then we can do more than remember her. We can honor her. We can listen to the silence she left behind and promise not to repeat it.